All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the break. We are now turning to our third panel, which is data-informed pretrial justice. How do we know what is working? You all have heard a lot about data from, I think, every panelist who has spoken thus far, and there's a good reason for that. Criminal justice data is essential to understanding how systems currently work and identifying ways to improve them. But speaking nationally, not even specific to Washington State or either of the jurisdictions here, criminal justice data is kind of abysmal, and it can be a real challenge to gather information about even just the basics of a system. But a lot of jurisdictions are working that, including Pierce and Thurston and at the state level. So we want to talk about that today and some of the issues it raises and what reporters can do to ask for the right kinds of data to inform your reporting. So let me introduce our panel. Starting to my left is Dr. Andrew Peterson, a senior research associate with the Washington State Center for Court Research. On Zoom, we have Dr. Dave Olson and Dr. Don Steeman. They co-direct the Center for Criminal Justice at Loyola University Chicago, and are co-authors of the 2023 study, Is Bail Reform Causing an Increase in Crime? Spoiler alert, the answer is no. We'll talk about that later. You know both Patrick and Michael from the prior panel. Patrick is the Chief Public Defender for Thurston County, and Michael is the Chief Public Defender for the Pierce County Department of Assigned Counsel. And Gaurav Sharma is an attorney in the Pierce County Department of Assigned Counsel. So Andrew, wanted to start with you. The Washington State Pretrial Reform Task Force called out data collection as being fundamental to improving pretrial systems in Washington, and they made recommendations for improving data collection. Can you talk about the challenges local systems face and making good on sort of that recommendation? And can you describe just some of the key data points that are needed to evaluate pretrial performance?
Sure. Thank you, Matt. So I think there are a couple of issues, first of all, in terms of challenges. The first and kind of biggest being that the system is not set up for oversight, right? You have a case management system, the place where you keep your data. It's set up for the practitioner. Okay, when a policeman makes a stop, they need to know, does that person have a warrant? Is that person wanted somewhere? When a judge sees someone, they need to know, is the criminal history? What is that person's criminal history? What is their history look like in terms of appearances in the court? And that works for that. It's set up for that reason. It works for that reason. What happens is when those systems are designed, they're not set up with the foresight of oversight. So we're not thinking 2 years down the line, next year, 6 months from now, we need to check this. We need to take a look at disparities. We need to take a look at what's happening. It's set up, for that practitioner. So because it's not set up for the oversight, as researchers, we have to come in later and kind of cobble together things. And I think to Don and Dave's credit and my colleagues' credit, in research, I think we do the best we can. I think we do a pretty good job and we make it work. But we're missing something still. So that's the first big challenge. And we've seen that in other places, things like bail, right? In order to get bail amounts, see, is bail being done equally? Bail, we get bail data is collected, it's like accounts receivable. The jail needs to know, hey, did this person pay what they were supposed to pay to get out? And when they do that, they set the number at 0 and they move on. There's no way of tracking, going back and looking over time. So people like my colleagues here to the left have to do it by hand, right? So it's not formally set up that way. The second biggest challenge is that pretrial, when we talk about pretrial, it's a lot of different moving pieces. You got the police are involved, both law enforcement on the street and patrol. You've got law enforcement in the jail. You've got the court. You've got pretrial services, and they're all different entities whose data doesn't talk to each other. So if we want to look across that system, we have to go back in again after the fact and kind of stitch things together to try and do that. And we do the best we can, but it's never going to be perfect because it's not set up that way. So those are ones I see as the biggest challenge. In terms of what we want to look at, I think there are some basics. You want to know, who is the pretrial population, right? Disparities are a big issue. Everybody, that's not a new fact or a new revelation. So that's always going to be in there. What do disparities look like in the pretrial population? You want to know who's failing and succeeding. You want to know, what's the court's response when people are failing and succeeding, those kinds of things. There's a great document done by the National Institute of Corrections called Measuring What Matters that gives a lot of that. I think that is the whole universe of kind of what you would want in there. It was created by practitioners and researchers together to think about these issues. So I think that universe, that's the universe of what you want, and then the jurisdiction should go within that universe and pick out kind of what's important to them.
Great, thank you for setting the stage. I want to turn to you, Dave and Don. You're collecting pretrial data from local jurisdictions in Illinois. And just to set this up for the reporters here today, about 6 months ago, Illinois implemented what is known as the Pretrial Fairness Act, which introduced some very historic changes to their pretrial system. We don't have time to go into the details, although if you're interested, please reach out to Holly. But as I mentioned earlier, among the things it did was eliminate the use of money bond entirely. So Don, you and Dave have, I think, the mammoth job of examining the data from past practices to estimate the potential impact of this new law, the Pretrial Fairness Act. What are you finding as you reach out to the local systems, and if there are any similarities or differences between what you heard Andrew describe here in Washington, please highlight those as well.
Yeah, thanks everybody for having us. I'll take this question. I think probably in hindsight, it shouldn't have been a surprise, but as we worked with local jurisdictions to better understand what the potential impact might be, a lot of them had predictions. And what we oftentimes asked was, what do current practices look like? There was only one county out of the 102 in Illinois that understood what the current practices look like, and that's the county where Chicago is. And so, as was brought up, a lot of information is collected by practitioners. They're used to make individual decisions about individual cases. They're not designed to be aggregated and provide a sense of what's currently going on in the local jurisdiction. So the research that we're doing in Illinois, we're working with roughly 35 of the state's 102 counties to collect information to try to examine what's going on, not only since the law went into effect, but more importantly, what was happening before the law went into effect. So part of our goal is to understand, did the law actually change what happens with pretrial defendants? Did it change the likelihood that they'd be held pretrial? Did it change the likelihood that they would miss court dates or be charged with new criminal activity? When we spoke with local stakeholders, they all suspected in many instances that the law is going to result in more people missing court dates and more people being charged with new criminal activity. When we asked them what was the current rate of those, they didn't know. They didn't have any understanding of what percent of people, for example, were held pretrial, or how long they stayed, or what percent stayed until the disposition of their case. And so we're working with these jurisdictions now to collect that information. What we can say is, when we've provided them with analyses, many of them are thrilled to actually have someone providing them with research support or analysis that helps them better understand how their system is functioning. I think the important thing to keep in mind is local jurisdictions usually don't have dedicated staff to do research. They've got staff that are handling cases, not sitting back and looking at the system as a whole. So what we found is that when we're able to provide them with that information, they're thrilled to get it, because they never had seen kind of the big picture of the work that they're doing. So far, what we found in the research that we've done is, as a result of this law going into effect, or following the law going into effect, the number of people in jail has gone down. It hasn't gone down as many people predicted. There were some predictions that the jails would empty. We're finding fairly modest decreases that are associated with the change in the law. The other thing that people are asking us is, have the rates of failure to appear or new criminal activity increased? Are defendants now less likely to plead guilty or to take prison sentences based on the concern that under the old system that people would plead guilty quickly to get out of jail? It's still too early to make those kind of conclusions. You have to let cases matriculate through their end, right? You can't look at cases that have only had 1 or 2 court dates and make conclusions about the rate of a failure to appear or people being charged with new crimes.
Thanks, Dave. That's really helpful context. And one I used to say, if you called 100 random counties in the U.S. and asked them what their failure to appear rate is, in other words, what's their court appearance rate of people released pretrial, 99% of them wouldn't know, and 1% would give you a number and it would be wrong. And I'm not sure if that's much of an exaggeration, honestly. And so I think what it illustrates, and I think what Dave is saying about the state of data in Illinois, which is true essentially everywhere, is that a lot of systems are flying a bit blind, right? They don't know how their system is currently performing on the metrics that matter. So it is very hard, if not, really it's impossible to say how a particular pretrial change in policy or practice is going to improve anything or change anything for the better or the worse. And so I think that's just something to know, that the baseline stats on pretrial systems generally are not known. And there is, I think, a big role that states can play in considering providing funding for data collection and for standardizing the data, so that if you say, here's our court appearance rate in Thurston, just picking these 2 jurisdictions because they're here, but in Thurston, our court appearance rate is X, in Pierce, our court appearance rate is Y, that they're actually talking about the same thing. So there's a lot of links between the local and state level when it comes to data. So Patrick, Michael, and Gaurav, both of your offices have started collecting pretrial data. And I wanted to just ask you what kind of motivated you in undertaking this effort to collect data in your office, and what data are you collecting now?
Sure, I'll go first. So when we, Thurston County, were selected as a research action site, we were, probably about 10 months into the project, and we're talking about discussing what our current practice is, et cetera. And so I just said, maybe what I'll do is to start tracking the daily data, right? And so got a chance to meet Dr. Peterson, and he really perked up when I said, this is what we're going to start doing. And I think to the points that were made earlier, a confirmation that, well, nobody collects that data. So we took a real basic approach. Again, this is all in-kind hours from my office and everybody a part of the project. We don't have additional staff to do the work. But we just looked at real basic daily data. So when someone gets arrested and they appear before, in our case, our Superior Court judges in the afternoon to make these decisions on release or a financial condition, we just started tracking that data on a daily basis. So if it was a new arrest on a new allegation, and part of the project included for us, and I think for Pierce County as well, part of the project is to take a look at all Washington crimes and determine which crimes in Washington would be considered violent offenses and non-violent offenses. So we have this big category of all crimes in Washington, whether they would be considered a violent offense or a non-violent offense. And so we capture that data. Is it a new violent offense or a new non-violent offense? And when they appear in court, what was the recommendations of the prosecuting attorney? Was it a financial condition or not? What was the recommendation of the defense attorney? Financial condition or not? What was the judge's decision? Was it a financial condition or not? But if it was a financial condition, which legal prong, I think that you heard in the first presentation from the bench, was used, stated as the legal basis to set a financial condition, right? So really pretty basic data that frankly anybody can do with a basic spreadsheet. And then we started collecting that data, right? So we've, eclipsed 1,000 cases and then over 2,000 cases. And then we did, I think to the point that was made earlier, we don't have, our own data analyst here locally. We're all, sort of as justice players, in the weeds every day, just with the nuts and bolts work, but being able to forward that data on to our team and then have them analyze it and then share it with our team, right? So to get to those questions of how often do we use a financial condition? What's the average amount of a financial condition for a non-violent offense, et cetera? How often are the judges using this particular legal prong to set a financial condition? So we can again start to assess on, how we're performing and, all these big data points.
Thank you. Gaurav?
I'll let Mike talk about the data that's collected since he started that. Where I'm involved in, the aspect I'm looking at is now we have this data. What are we doing with this data? So what I'm looking at is analyzing the data, different aspects of it, and seeing has any change actually been made. And with Dr. Olson brought up earlier, that what we're seeing actually is the numbers are going back to where they were. That yes, there were some reductions in jail population for some time, but now we're seeing the numbers are kind of going back to where they were pre-pandemic. So we want to look at that data and then dissect it more and see why is that? Why is the change not happening since so much time and effort was spent to change to get more people out of jail? And I'll let Mike talk about what data we're actually collecting in detail.
I think what motivated us, I think it's been alluded to that the initial portion of this project was to come up with providing more objective data to the courts in order to make as informed decision as possible regarding conditions of release. So all the parties got together and vetted that. And I think it's important to stress that this objective data gathering or this PSA that's talked about, it's not a determinator of if someone gets, it remains in custody or gets released. It's only information that's be used by the court. And obviously the court has discretion to make decisions. So with that, I guess the next thought would be, well, there's additional objective information being provided to the court. How's it being used? And does it make any difference? And I guess one of the challenges, again, that's been talked about, our systems, we represent individual people. We don't really represent the system. So information gathering at a systemic level like that is not something we're either equipped or frankly resourced to do. And so with that and those limitations, it seemed that a natural thing would be if you have objective data that's presented that recommends release with little to no conditions and no monetary bail, how many times is bail being requested in that kind of situation? How many times is bail being imposed? What are the jail demographics? When you look at them, and I think Worf had alluded to this, when we're looking at current jail data for our particular jurisdiction, it pretty much mimics what we saw pre-COVID in 2019. And the trend levels to me don't seem to be changing much. So it's an indicator of kind of what's happening in the system. But the benefit of being in this program allows us to go back to that type of information. And these ad hoc decisions or discussions about this happened in this particular case versus that, to be real honest, it accomplishes nothing. But when you actually have data that's vetted and has been gathered over hundreds of situations, then I think it starts being meaningful. And I think people need to pay attention to that. And again, it's information that everyone agreed was important. So it's something I think that by definition should be considered. So those are the kind of things that we've been trying to do.
Thank you. And I just to emphasize, I mean, what Michael and Gaurav and Patrick are doing in their offices, it may sound sort of basic in terms of the information you're able to get from it, but it is way more than most jurisdictions have. And it really, as Michael was just highlighting, can inform policy decisions, right? If you see the post-COVID jail population start to bounce back up to pre-COVID levels, well, why is that happening? Is that pretrial population? Is that what's driving it? If it's pretrial, You know, you can slice it. Is it felonies or misdemeanors? There may be claims that violent crime is going up. Well, is that happening? Is that who's in the jail? Maybe it's lower level crimes. Maybe it's a change in prosecutorial policy. Maybe the demographics are changing. So there are a bunch of things that you can do policy-wise to address something that you might identify as a problem. But if you don't have data to really understand the problem, then you have no idea what policy will address it. And so this kind of data collection is absolutely essential to these policy discussions. And I think there's a movement nationally to really try to fortify and build up the criminal justice data, because people are realizing that otherwise you're just bandying about anecdotes and there's no way to kind of show evidence about what's happening and what works. So just to put a finer point on some of what's being done here. Want to turn back to you, Dave and Don. You did a study of which you published called "Is Bail Reform Causing an Increase in Crime?" Right? That's an argument we have heard nationally in a lot of jurisdictions. Your conclusion, your response to that question was essentially no. Given our discussion so far, the lack of systematic evaluation and data collection to help you understand pretrial outcomes, what did you learn from your research that can help reporters when they're covering pretrial systems?
Thanks. Hi, this is Don. I want to thank everybody for having us. I'll take this question. I think that what you point out in your question is important to realize. There are few evaluations of bail reform out there, systematic evaluations of bail reform out there, and those that do exist rarely look at the impact of those reforms on either crime rates or new criminal conduct committed by those who are on pretrial release. So this paper started with right trying to summarize what we could find out there from the few evaluations that do exist, and that look at those specific questions. I think the first thing that we take away from those evaluations is that bail reform that we looked at rarely changes the number of people who are released or the percentage of people who are released. It just changes how they're released and when they're released. What we found across most of these evaluations was that the number of people and the percent of people released before their trial remained fairly constant. It just shortened the time period that they were held pretrial, or it eliminated their need to provide money bail to be released. So I think the first thing to think about is that it's not really changing the population that's being released too much. Second, that what we found about what happened to people when they were released pretrial was fairly consistent across all of the studies. The percent of people who were arrested for a new offense while they were released was pretty low, around 10 to 15% across all the studies that we looked at. The percent of people who were arrested for a new violent offense during pretrial release was incredibly low, just 1 to 3%. So what those evaluations that do exist, the success rates of those who are released pretrial, it's very, very good. I think the other thing to take away from that is that pretrial crime is a small fraction of overall crime, right? Jurisdictions rarely report on trends in arrests among people who are on pretrial. They generally just report on overall crime rates. So what we have to do is dig into those few studies that do exist to try to understand, okay, of those people who were released, we can see what their new criminal conduct was or the rate at which they committed new offenses and compare that to the overall changes in crime rates after reform. So what we found was that those people who did commit new offenses contributed very small fractions to overall crime rates. And I think the other thing to take away from that is that crimes are affected by a multitude of factors. It's not just policy. Crime trends tend to be long-term trends. They're seasonal. They generally have long-term seasonal trends. A single policy change rarely impacts short-term crime trends. So I think the one thing to take away from this when we're thinking about a reform effort and trying to understand how it's going to affect crime, rarely does a policy affect crime in the very short term. And I think that's kind of what we take away from this. The big takeaway, as you pointed out at the beginning, was that we found that across all of these reforms, they didn't really change crime rates. They had no discernible impact on overall crime rates. The people who did commit new offenses while in pretrial release contributed very, very little to the overall crime trends. I think the one thing to take away is to understand that a single incident that might happen after reform is not indicative of an overall trend in crime. And that, I think, is important for people to take away.
Thank you. And just to underscore one of the points you made, there was an interesting study out of New Mexico a year or two ago that looked at, essentially tried to isolate the impact of the impact on overall crime of people charged with violent or serious crimes and released pre-trial. And basically what they found is if you just incarcerated everybody pre-trial, you didn't release anybody pre-trial who was charged with a violent crime, and don't quote me on the stat because it might not be exactly right, but essentially like your homicide rate would be dropped by like 2%. I mean, it's just, most crimes are committed by people who are just out there like you and me. They're not on pretrial release, they're not under pretrial supervision. So that's why there's this, it's such a disconnect to talk about overall crime rates and pretrial release, because it, you know, one is dwarfed by the other. So I want to open this question to everybody. What can reporters do if their local system can't answer some of these basic questions, like what is the pretrial population, what's the court appearance rate, what's the rate of people not being arrested while they're on pretrial release? What recommendations do you have for reporters?
I can start.
Sure.
More detailed story. I mean, more details are needed. So I mean, story where somebody's on pretrial release, they go out committed murder. That's going to be a sensational story. Everybody's going to read it. Everybody's going to pick it up. If you do a little bit of digging, there's probably more issues than that. It's probably, you know, mental health issues, variety of issues that were involved in that case. And as we've said it again and again, that's an exception to the rule. Just because one person did it doesn't mean you should lock everybody up pretrial and keep them in because one person got out and committed a crime. Maybe use the studies, use the stats saying majority of people on pretrial release do not commit crimes. Always cover that, the other side of it. That'd be my recommendation.
Well, you know, I certainly, you know, my first recommendation is start asking these questions. You know, in my opinion, yes, we're breaking ground here. I think with some of the data collection that we're doing, but I think asking questions of, you know, other jurisdictions, of your local officials or peers to myself and others that you've heard on these panels, these are questions that need to be asked, and I think they'd be well received. I think a lot of jurisdictions, I think ourselves included, we just didn't know what we didn't know what we didn't know, and B, there are things that every jurisdiction can do that isn't that heavy of a lift to start to get to some of the fundamental pieces of data that we're talking about here. Because I believe every judicial officer, every public defender, every prosecutor, you know, in the state of Washington would like to know this data. They earnestly would want to know what the data is and how they're performing. It's just they need a roadmap. And you know, I think we've set some opportunities here for other jurisdictions to you know, they're not going to maybe get the support that we've gotten along the way, but at least on these fundamental foundational data collection points about their pretrial practices, it's not as heavy a lift or daunting as I think some people might think it is. And one last point is to Blar's example, right? And you know, judicial officers have a very difficult job. It's a very challenging position for them to rule every day on these hearings in a very short amount of time, and sometimes with limited information. But I think it's imperative that we, as a society, recognize and educate the community on the law, what the law in Washington is, and respect for judicial officers and the decisions that they have to make in this, you know, in this framework.
Andrew, anything that you've been, obviously not as a journalist, but you've been in the position of asking lots of Washington jurisdictions for data. Any thoughts about this?
Yeah. So a couple things. One, yeah, keep asking, like Patrick said. You know, we as researchers, we hate saying I don't know. That's the worst thing we can do. Ruins our day. So if you can ask that question and ask it repeatedly, and ask the people that direct us, right? Because I have no shortage of work right now. I'm, you know, being pulled 100 different directions. But if someone above me says, hey, this is a priority, we need to find out, that goes away and I focus on that. And I'll get that answer. You know, we can get that answer. We're working towards that answer in you know, local counties here, but we can get it. We just need, the push from above. We need someone to make it a priority for us. So asking that question makes it a priority.
Great. So Dave and Don, I wanted to turn back to you. What would you say reporters should know about kind of evaluating competing claims when they're told a policy change is responsible for a trend in crime in either direction when those claims are made, which they often are? How would you frame that for reporters?
I'm trying to come up with a succinct way to say it. I think oftentimes we look for simple solutions, right? We want a simple answer to explain things, and rarely in our field are the explanations simple, right? So I think that's one of the things to recognize is that if someone says, "Oh, it's because of this policy that this has happened," it's fairly easy to go back in time and say, "Has that ever happened before?" Right? Did that ever happen before the policy? And if so, then it's clearly not just the policy that caused this. It's likely other things that are happening. So if we oftentimes have the question with specific cases, right? Here's a specific case where we had a bad outcome, and it happened during the course of this policy being implemented. Therefore, it's the policy. And we usually just ask the simple question of, has that ever happened before? Has someone released pre-trial ever committed a crime before? And obviously the answer is yes. So these things happen, not just because of the policy, but they do happen. They have happened before. It's not just because of the policy. If you have any other ideas, Don.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. As I said before, a single incident is not indicative of the full impact of a policy or a trend in crime, say, after, or of the failure of a policy after it's been implemented. I think that's one important thing to keep in mind, and be skeptical of anecdotes that may push that idea. I think it's important to keep the individual incidents separate from overall trends or policy outcomes.
Yeah, and in this space, that's usually what happens, right? There's a specific incident that occurs that gets a lot of attention, and people are focused on it, and they want someone to blame, right? They want again there to be a simple scapegoat or a simple explanation to it. The other thing that we try to get reporters and also practitioners to think about is, like Don said earlier, the likelihood that people released pretrial will commit a crime is relatively low, and that they'll commit a violent crime is extremely low, right? But we should still obviously be concerned that there's crime being committed. When we become so fixated on when it occurred, right? Did it occur in the month during pretrial release, or did it occur a month after they'd been sentenced and put on probation, or did it happen a year from now after they'd served a prison sentence? Again, the likelihood of the incident occurring is extremely low. We should obviously want to do things to prevent it, but just focusing on what's happening pre-trial as though it's the only time period that matters is also something that we have to kind of get away from. And just one other comment to the earlier thing about what should reporters ask when they don't have the data. I think the point raised was you should ask, why aren't you measuring it? Why aren't you collecting it? If it's such an important aspect of public safety or an important element of the justice system, we should be measuring what goes on. And if not, then through that, we're indicating that it's not as important as other things.
I'm sorry, can I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
I think it's important to note that we spent, and we just did too, we spent a lot of time talking about the negative impacts of reforms rather than focusing on the positive aspects of reforms. And I think even the bail reform efforts that we've seen in evaluations, we can point to, failure rates of 15%, but that means 85% of the people who were released pre-trial were successful. And if we think about bail reform as some of them increasing the number of people who were released or the time at which they were released, those success rates are important. And it's important to talk about how bail reform leads to positive outcomes for people. It can be time they don't spend in jail. It can be money saved through not having to pay monetary bail to be released. It's the ability to keep a job, to keep their housing, so their kids don't go to foster care. All of those are positive aspects of bail reform that as we think about changing who's released pretrial or when they're released pretrial, all of those things are important to focus on too, and not get bogged down and only focusing on the failure that you see of people who are released pretrial, or the failure of policy reforms.
Thanks, Don. And that's a great point of kind of how pretrial stories are framed. And I think, Patrick, Michael, Gaurav, curious what your perspective on kind of that framing and the additional sources that reporters might look to in balancing out a story.
Well, as representing individual people, it's often difficult for us to respond to individual inquiry, and I think it's been alluded to, there isn't just a spreadsheet that we could provide to you that answers all these questions, but there is a significant amount of data that's accessible. And I think contacting everyone in the system is important to get a better picture of what's really happening. Who's in the jail, what are they there for, what are the demographics? Those are readily accessible. It gives you ideas as to what the system is and what the system is doing. Not necessarily there's a direct correlation, but there's clearly a significant one there. So I think that type of information, contacting people, all people in the system, I think be more than willing to do the best we could to provide it, or to direct you to someone who could. And the other, I guess the other takeaway would be the use of static data alone. I mean, that has consequences, I think, because it perpetuates system activities, whether that be good or bad. And so part of this is to try and get away from just that alone, get into other things with an understanding that there are additional things that could be done other than incarcerating people with money bail.
In our last few minutes, if there aren't questions in the chat, we have about 5. Anything else that you would add by way of recommendations for reporters? Things you think merit coverage, or perspectives you think should be included when reporters are thinking about these issues? Patrick, I'll start with you.
Sure. So, my advice is the same advice that I give to community members or organizations that want to know more about the justice system, right? These hearings take place every day in every corner of the state of Washington. And so I always, give the advice that these are obviously open hearings to the public, to the media. Get involved. If you really have the support of your organization to fully develop a story around what we're talking about here today, you have resources, available to learn more about the projects. But take the opportunity to spend a month every afternoon observing hearings, watch these decisions being made, watch the information being shared. You have access to public records that are being filed. You have the same information that the parties, in every hearing have access to, and you'll really get a much better sense of what this looks like on a daily basis if you can have that support. So that's just one thing that comes to mind, is you can draw your own conclusions of the process by just observing if you have that support. And then, to Mike's point, then you can have opportunities to follow up with the stakeholders that participate in those hearings that you observed. I think you give a bigger perspective on context of what we're talking about.
Andrew, Michael, Gaurav, sorry, please go ahead.
I feel like a lot of the thinking behind, taking a sheriff's post about, this person was released and they stole another car, is like, that's probably the easiest story for a newspaper reporter or TV reporter on deadline, right? Is to pick up that thing. It's conflict. People will read it. People are probably commenting on Facebook. I wouldn't necessarily argue that those stories are newsworthy in the first place and that they should be covered. But so I guess I'm wondering what sorts of decisions are being made in the system that you all think are newsworthy? What are the stories that could be covered instead of, you know, focusing on an anecdote like that? How could that anecdote maybe be used to inform further reporting as opposed to that quick reactive story?
Terrific question.
Very good question.
I would actually just use your story. Not even change the story, just you're reporting on the story, person's release, they stole the vehicle. Of course, people want to hear about it, you want to report on it. You want to get clicks, you want to get people to read your story, but you want to get more details. They were on pretrial release, they were presumed innocent, they had a right to be released, presumptions release. So you want those details also included, so it doesn't just make the judge look bad, just make the defense attorney look bad. It doesn't make the prosecutor's office sometimes look bad, because the prosecutor's office in that case may not even ask for bail. So if you included those details, that covers the story fairly. Public's informed now, they can certainly draw their own light story, what they want to draw from it, but you've done your job and covered all the details.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, I think to Dave's point earlier that he made is, that's one example of a case. But the story is the bigger system, right? And play all the things that we're talking about here. So you provide context to that one particular case, let's say, for example, or this particular case, it's at least informing your community of the context in which that case came to the community's attention. You know, again, trying to educate the community that this is the larger system in play. Here's the fundamentals of the law. Here's the decision-making process. So they have the context. So it's not just being interpreted as this is the practice of this community. These things happen in this community. You know, drawing conclusions without the context of, you know, at least in our cases here in Thurston and Pierce County, the larger project that we're endeavoring, and you have that background. Just my thought.
Dave or Don, any thoughts on that question?
I think that point of what the context is, right? So there was an incident where someone stole a car, providing some context of how rare that is, that out of all the people released, out of the thousands of people released, what small share of individuals actually do that, kind of flipping it around to what Don said. Yeah, there's some people that get arrested for crimes after they're released pre-trial, but the vast majority do not. And it's at least something that we try to get people to think of is the only way to prevent that is to detain everybody forever. That's the only way you can make sure that no one will commit another crime. And you have to start realizing that would be obviously extremely expensive, violate all sorts of constitutional rights, but would yield a relatively small public safety benefit because again, the likelihood that people are going to be arrested is relatively low.
Well, I think with that, we will conclude this panel. Actually, that question is a very nice segue into our next panel, where you're going to hear from people who have experiences that typically aren't reported on, not reported on enough, people who have been through the system themselves or touched it otherwise through crime victimization or both. And those are stories that are very, I think, undercovered in the press. And so it's a great segue to that panel. But before we segue to that, let's thank this panel on data. Really appreciate all of you participating.
Thank you all for being here.